It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Mike Pieciak is a rising star in Vermont politics. In 2022, he was elected state treasurer. Before that, he worked for 8 years at the Department of Financial Regulation, first as deputy commissioner and then as the commissioner. There, he played key roles in the state's pandemic response and untangling the Ponzi-like fraud in the Northeast Kingdom. The 40-year-old Democrat also has higher ambitions and has talked to insiders about running for governor, likely after Phil Scott steps aside. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, we talk with the Brattleboro native who is inspired to become a lawyer, get this, by the movie My Cousin Vinny, starring tough guy actor Joe Pesci. We began by discussing his efforts in the state treasurer's office to connect Vermonters with money they might not have even known they were owed, including me, who got a $29 check from his office's unclaimed property fund just a short time ago. While we talked, his dog Jetty and my dog Daphne had a conversation of their own. All right, I'm not asking you to be on here because you just gave me a $29 check. You've been giving out a lot of money these days.
Yeah.
What's the story with that?
Yeah, well, unclaimed property, it's really something that's important for Vermonters to think about and to consider. We have $120 million of unclaimed property at the Treasurer's Office, so we do our best to return as much as we can every year. But despite our best efforts, we send out maybe tens of thousands of claims, millions of dollars, but even more comes in every year. That amount of money grows and grows and grows. So we've been trying to really be proactive with messaging that it's there. We have partnered with Tom Messner to do a paid campaign.
Wow.
We usually have a paid campaign every year. Tom was a great person to partner with on that. We started to do some automatic payment programs. So we had a pilot project where we sent 350 Vermonters about $200 each to get them their unclaimed property back automatically. We did the same thing with nonprofits. We try to highlight some favorable stories as well around unclaimed property. We had a really nice story that was in connection to the nonprofit pilot project where a family had set up a foundation for their son who had passed away at a really young age from cancer. And the foundation was designed to help young people who are dealing with cancer, giving them something exciting in their lives, whether it's a trip or some sort of activity. It's sort of helping them with that, take their mind off their treatment, have their family look at them seeing them with some excitement and some hope in their lives. And they had about $25,000 they had forgotten about.
Wow. And
we were able through that automatic program to get them this money. The foundation is going to get back up and active again. We always encourage people to check missingmoney.gov. It's pretty easy to claim. We try to make it very straightforward.
My dog Daphne is going to be interrogating your dog Jetty, so that's what's going on in the background there. So I found out about it through reading the story that's at 7 Days that Paula Routley wrote. So why can't you find people?
Yeah, so 7 Days. We started with nonprofits because they are easily identifiable. When we see 7 Days, we know who is the rightful owner of that property. When we see really identifiable businesses, that's relatively easy to get money back. But when we see John Smith from Bennington, it gets really challenging to determine sort of on an individual level who's who. When we did that individual partnership, or that individual pilot project, I should say, with the 350 people, we had to partner with the tax department for them to help us verify who the individuals were. We cross-referenced Social Security numbers in their database, and then we got updated mailing addresses for them. So we had a really high confidence that we were returning it to the right people in that circumstance.
That makes sense, yeah.
But oftentimes we don't have complete information. Oftentimes it's a really generic name, and that becomes a real challenge.
I like to think I'm the only Mark Johnson, but I know there are others out there. You grew up in Brattleboro. Let's talk about how you got into the legal business. I saw that you were motivated by watching My Cousin Vinny. What's the deal with that? Joe Pesci is the reason why you became a lawyer?
Pretty much. I was pretty young and impressionable watching, My Cousin Vinny, and I...
Great role model.
Yeah, great role model. I thought that it really did stand for the little guy, being able to overcome adversity, put the work in, have a unique background, and then still come out, victorious. So I found there to be some, underlying good merit in that movie, but it was also just a funny movie. And I really, appreciated those courtroom scenes where it was sort of the big reveal and the prosecution had worked up their case, but they'd forgotten about some angle, and the Joe Pesci character was able to figure it out and, save his clients. So it really was something that motivated me to want to be a lawyer. And when I got to law school, there are other reasons too, but when I got to law school, that was sort of what I still envisioned wanting to do, is be a trial lawyer. And then I realized how few trials actually occur generally, but also just, across the board in terms of federal court, state court. Maybe if you're a public defender or prosecutor, maybe you're in court more frequently, but even there, a lot of those cases settle. So once I realized that being a lawyer was a lot less about the courtroom and much more about being in your office behind your computer, became a little less interesting to me.
You wound up going to New York working for a really prestigious firm, Skadden Arps. How did that come about?
Yeah. So I didn't know what a big law firm was when I went to law school. For me, a big law firm was, Downs, Racklin, Martin, and Brattleboro that had maybe 8 lawyers, and it was a part of a bigger law firm, up here in Burlington. I remember my friends were applying to these big firms, and they were saying, "Why are you going to apply to them?" And I said, "No, I don't even know what that is." And I looked into it a little bit. I started to apply to some in Miami. That's where I went to law school. It really wasn't going very well, the interview process, because they wanted people that were committed to being in Miami, and I really wasn't committed to being in Miami. But it's given me an opportunity to reflect on, what was it I wanted to do immediately following graduation. And I thought, maybe this big law thing, maybe there's something to it. I can get good experience. I can learn some things. But if I'm going to do that, I should do it in New York City, not in Miami. In New York, just much more opportunity. People are much more transient. They'll understand somebody that wants to come only for a few years. So I set my sights on New York. I was very fortunate to get connected with someone that had worked at Skadden Arps, and they recommended me to their team. That was their recruiting team. Funny enough, as things happen, they sent me a letter to ask me to interview, and they put the wrong mailing address on the letter. And I never knew they actually wanted to interview me until very late in the process, when I ran into the dean of the law school, and she said, "Hey, have you ever interviewed with that firm?" And I said, "No, I never heard from them." And I called them. They said,
Wow.
We realized we had the wrong address. I flew up that weekend and had a great visit. And it was the only firm I had visited with that I really wanted to actually work there. So, I was excited for that opportunity.
And what kind of law did you do there?
So I started with corporate restructuring and then went to mergers and acquisitions. So it was all corporate work, which was funny because that was not, being motivated to go to law school by my cousin Vinny. In law school, I didn't focus on corporate work. I was focusing, a little bit on corporate work, but sort of constitutional law and these sort of other areas that interested me. But I started with corporate restructuring because it was both corporate and there is also trial work with that if you're in bankruptcy court or something like that. Migrated to mergers and acquisitions because I really was intrigued by the negotiations. I was really intrigued by what two sides of a transaction are looking for in each other, and why certain things make sense in terms of a merger, understanding what the pros and cons are of a transaction. I think there's a lot of things that are applicable there, outside of the legal profession, but it really helps you sum up what is it that your client wants, what is it that the opposing client wants, and trying to distill that down into a way that you can then negotiate around.
So, and I'll spare you, by the way, my Joe Pesci imitation. How did you wind up in Vermont state government? You started as deputy commissioner at at Department of Financial Regulation.
Yeah. So I, was working in New York. Before that time, I actually came back to Vermont for a little while. This was in my sort of mid to late 20s, and I was back in Burlington. I was back for about a year and realized, I did want to come back to Vermont, but it was a little too soon. I wanted to go back to New York. Right before I did that, it was in 2012 when Bill Sorrell was running against
T.J. Donovan. Yeah.
So
What a race.
it was quite the race. So I, was just sort of intrigued by it and reading about it and whatnot. And I was growing up in Vermont. I just was such a fan of Howard Dean when he was governor for most of my, coming of age. And I found out that Howard and Bill were pretty close, and that Bill Sorrell's mother was Howard Dean's mentor, and then so that made me really interested about Bill just because of that connection. And a family friend of ours, Kate O'Connor, who had worked for Howard Dean, said, "You got to meet Bill Sorrell. He's just it'd be great for you to get to connect with him." And I did. And the first time I met Bill, he was wearing sort of like Tevas and a tie-dye T-shirt and these shorts, and I go, boy, this guy's going to lose this race. just taking one sort of look at him, and it's funny that I say that because I became so close to him over time. But I gave him my card, thinking I maybe would never hear from him again, and he called me the next day and said, "We have a campaign meeting.
Wow.
I'd like you to come to." And I said, "Sure." And then there was a little bit of disarray among all the volunteers that were there at the campaign meeting, and still was thinking, boy, I don't know how he's going to do in this race. And then eventually he asked me to meet with him one night, and he asked if I'd be his campaign manager. And he didn't know that I was going back to New York, and I hadn't told my law firm yet either. And I was trying to think, what am I going to do for the next 6 months? It's tough to just sort of be at a place where you're going to leave. And so it provided for the perfect opportunity. I told him I'd be happy to do it. And through that process, actually, the person that was supporting TJ, Harlan Sylvester, he, after the race was over, I met and saw Harlan, and we'd been in touch with each other, and told him I was going back to New York and this and that and the other thing. And then a couple of years later, when the commissioner at DFR was looking for a deputy, she talked to Harlan, and he said, Mike's down in New York, maybe you should give him a ring. And she did, and I wasn't really necessarily looking to leave at the time, but opportunities to be in state government I saw as coming around, far and few between. So I jumped at it, and that was about 10 years ago. I moved back to Vermont.
Wow. What a bunch of small world connections right there. I mean, Vermont really is pretty tight when it comes right down to it.
Yeah, for sure. And and growing up in Brattleboro, growing up in a small town, you realize that your opponent on one day could be your advocate on the other day. And, it's just a lesson that's observed at a very young age growing up in a small town. So it's certainly held out to be, something that's been important in my own professional development over time.
Like any reporter in Vermont, I've been fascinated by the EB5 story, as you know. And you really played a pretty critical role, came out with what's the infamous spaghetti map. So how soon after you got to Department of Financial Regulation did you get involved with the EB5 thing?
Yeah, it was really, really quite quick now that I'm looking back in retrospect. But I got to the department in February 2014. And by September of that same year, the governor sent a letter to our department asking us to work with ACCD to do oversight. So by December, we had the oversight role established. And then by January, we had our first meeting, January of 2015, first meeting with Jay Peak. And I came back to Vermont, and the reason I was interested in that securities role was because, at the time, crowdfunding was a big thing. You could, I thought, well, it wasn't investing. It was basically contributing money to an organization, and maybe you'd get a T-shirt back or you'd get your name in the movie credits. And I was really intrigued by, can you do this so that it's actually a small investment instead of, just a, non-equitable share. And we had a history of that in Vermont with Ben & Jerry's, raising money locally, other businesses. So that was really what I was coming back to really get excited about, was reviving these sort of local investment laws and sort of modernizing them. And I was focused on that for the first, 6 months to a year. But then all of a sudden, this thing that I had no expectation we would be involved with, landed on our desk. And still very clearly, remember the first meeting that we had in January with the Jay Peak developers, because we had like a list, it was like sort of like I thought of it like an M&A deal. We had our list of 18 things that we needed answers on, and 15 of the 18 things were answered in that meeting, but there were 3 things that really stood out. I remember asking the lawyers, what's going to happen if this was the ANC Bio transaction. What's going to happen when you put out this new PPM and all of a sudden the folks you've already raised money from want their money back because the timelines have changed or they view this as material? And they said, "Oh, don't worry about that. Mr. Quiros is a man of untold wealth," and it kind of just stuck out of my brain because they're just sort of insinuating, he's a very wealthy guy. He's got plenty of resources. Don't worry about that. And
red flag.
Yeah, red flag. They gave it the answer after that, but that was sort of the first reaction. So that was red flag. And then we had gotten this couple of pages of financial documents like a day or two before we met with them. And up in the corner, it said margin loan. And there wasn't much of an explanation, but we asked about that. We said, why, there can be very perfectly innocent reasons why they would have had a margin loan on those financial statements.
Why would a man of untold wealth be getting a margin loan? Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
So they explained to us, and I remember, again, I had just come from New York, and not that I knew everything about business or finance, but you're involved in complicated transactions, and they described something to me that I remember thinking at the time, I don't understand what they just described to me. But I think in general what they were trying to say was that they would take the margin loan out. They would then buy treasuries with the margin loan, and the interest that they were earning on the treasuries was actually greater than the interest they were paying on the margin loan. So it was sort of like this arbitrage. And again, the response was sort of like Mr. Quiros, a very, very savvy financial investor and very savvy financial person. So he's sort of making good on this. And it took us about 10 months, but we went through every single margin loan transaction. We went through every single treasury bill transaction. And we were able to determine definitively that they had spent $2.3 million more in interest to the margin loans than they collected from the treasury bills. So we were able to disprove that. It took a long time to do it. But that was the second red flag. And then the third one was that we asked about the SEC because we had heard that the SEC was involved in the matter and wanted to know more about that. And again, they kind of said, it's don't worry about that. They haven't been in touch with the developers for a long time. And when they've been in touch with them, it's really high-level stuff, not stuff that is very meaningful. And we said okay, and so found out it was the Miami regional office that had been sort of engaged on this. And I had gone to Miami Law School, so I reached out to some friends and said, "Do you know who the head of the regional office is?" And got that person's contact information. This was like the next morning, and was able to get put in touch with their investigators really quickly and asked them. They say you haven't been in touch with them for a long time. They say the questions you have with them are pretty surface level, and their reaction was sort of like disbelief. And that was another sign for us that there was something more here that we needed to look at.
Wow, interesting. Just a couple of quick terms here: M&A, mergers and acquisition; PPM, private placement memorandum; SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So when was it the combination of those three that was really the, I don't want to say aha moment, but that's all I can think of. Is that when you knew?
Yeah. So it was January, that was January 28th or so, around that date. And, certainly the conversation with the SEC made you think, well, this is clearly something different than how they described it in the meeting. But, maybe they just perceived the relationship differently. So we were really waiting on that margin loan piece. We asked them, what they said they would do in the meeting was, we'll get you all the records that you need so that you can understand the margin loan. We'll get you all the Raymond James records. And we said, okay, that would be great. And we were waiting on those records first week of February, second week of February, third week of February, fourth week of February. And then we got a letter from their lawyer, different lawyer from New York, who provided a different rationale for why they had the margin loan. They said they had the margin loan because if they left it in a securities account and the securities firm for some reason went out of business, went bankrupt, that the money's not protected beyond $250,000. So they are buying treasuries to fully protect the investor's money. And that, again, raised its own red flags. It was a different explanation than that was given during the meeting. And there are much less complicated ways of doing the same thing with banks and with securities firms. They can sweep that money out, and basically your money, no matter how much money you have, goes into hundreds of different banks across the country for the night and then gets swept back into the account, so that you're sort of diversifying your risk. And that's a pretty common practice. Yep. even then. So that was the moment we said something here is not right. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know the extent of it. But that was sort of the moment we said, we are going to go get these records ourselves. We're not going to this is no longer a sort of oversight relationship where we are, having conversations with them. We're sort of trusting what they're giving us. This was sort of the verification piece. We needed to go beyond simply collecting data from them, collecting information from them, having conversations with them, and going directly to the source and starting to put that picture together.
So it became less, it was almost an investigation at that point.
Yeah, that's whenever folks say, when did you start your investigation? I say that was sort of the moment, like beginning of March of 2015. And then it took us a full year, 13 months. We didn't file the case until April of 2016. We had, I think it was 100,000 pages of financial transactions to look at, 150,000 individual transactions. We really wanted to make sure we were 100% right in bringing the case, because they were creating jobs. They were really well known in Vermont as doing a lot of good, meaning JPEAK and the principles of JPEAK. If you're going to, our greatest fear was that we would bring the case and then their lawyers or the principals would say, wait, you forgot about A, B, and C. A, B, and C explain the whole thing, and look at the state of Vermont being so foolish they don't understand that. Because they were so revered, it was somewhat unbelievable to think they could be involved in the biggest fraud in the state's history. So we really wanted to tie out every dollar, every penny. We ended up tracing all $440 million, through all of the various accounts, so that we could say definitively money was misappropriated, money was misused. There was just no explanation otherwise. The spaghetti chart is a great example of that. When we got the first round of documents from Raymond James, this is sometime in March of 2015, I remember having a big piece of paper thinking, okay, well, this will be a relatively easy exercise. There's 8 different projects. They have 8 different escrow accounts. They have 8 different operating accounts. And then from those operating accounts, they're paying invoices on 8 different projects. So we'll just represent those with boxes. I hand drew them. I showed, the arrows. I started to look through the financial transactions. All of a sudden, I was drawing arrows to different boxes. I had to draw new boxes that didn't exist. I had to erase. I had to rewrite. And I don't know how many days into that process, I sort of stopped and said, this is, okay, you can't do it this way. You can't verify it this easily. We're going to have to do this on the computer, and we're going to have a sort of a electronic-based program. And someone that had been working with me set off doing that. And at some point, he came back to me and said, I have the initial lay of the land here in terms of the transactions. And what we were trying to do is, for ourselves, visualize where did the money go, so we could sort of easily explain that to ourselves and to others. And he showed it to me for the first time on the computer. And I said, this makes no sense. I can't follow any of this. I'm thinking to myself, this is not helpful. And then I started to think to myself some more, well, we should continue to build this out because I think it might be helpful for us. Maybe it's that My Cousin Vinny element of the big reveal right at the press conference when the spaghetti chart got turned around. But that was, I think the thing that told Vermonters this is not right. All of our concern about, will everyone just think the state of Vermont's gotten this thing wrong? And of course, JPEAK and all the good things that they're doing, they must be the ones that are right, not the state of Vermont. I think when we turned around that spaghetti chart, it just visually told people something is wrong here. And I think that hopefully the state figured it out.
Go back here. There was a critical moment where there was a decision whether or not to allow more investors into the final project, the Q Burke project, and ANC Bio. And you were really one of the dissenting voices saying, don't let more investors in. Ultimately, there was a decision made to allow those investments to come in and put the money in escrow. Do you feel like you pushed hard enough on your viewpoint? Was it just a case of your bosses overruling you? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Now, looking back with the beauty of hindsight.
Yeah, I can think of very few times over the last 10 years where I pushed back harder on a decision than that decision. So I think I did everything I could have done. Somebody asked me at one point, why didn't you resign? And so we're in the middle of a case. Like there's sort of 2 things happening in parallel. There's that decision around Burke, around and bringing in new investors, but we're also on the working hard trying to prove what had been done the last 8 and 10 years, and I thought it would have been a disservice to leave at that point in the investigation. So, absent leaving, I said my piece. I made my case both directly and through email, and then said, well, we got to double down on the investigation. We got to get this thing right. We got to get it done as quickly as we can get it done, because that will prevent any more investors from getting harmed if we can figure this out as quickly as we can. So that was sort of the decision making. Again, in retrospect, the reason I didn't want to move forward at the time was not because we didn't come up with a good way of making sure the money was spent appropriately. It wasn't that. It was that I just didn't trust Stanger and Kuros and Jay Peak. I had viewed enough to know we shouldn't be putting our faith or trust in these folks or this organization, and we shouldn't go down this road together. That was what I was really concerned about. Again, in retrospect, the money did build the hotel. The investors that were already in the hotel, if we had not brought in new money, they would have been harmed because their money was already in and the hotel wasn't complete. Of course, then you had the new investors that came in, maybe not knowing the full extent of what was going on at Jay Peak. And, in fairness, we didn't know the full extent at that time either, but really challenging decision for state government to make.
Why do you think Susan Donegan and Peter Shumlin went in a different direction than what you thought?
Well,
they had the same information.
Yeah, they had most of the same information. I think I as the leader of the investigation, I was living in it more maybe than them. I just sort of you start to take on you start to really dig into that information. You start to really sort of emotionally get invested into the case. You start to understand who the people are. So maybe I was just more in the weeds in terms of the trust factor than them. But again, I've been asked about this, and I've said, in retrospect, in some ways you can't argue with the decision that they made, because neither decision was great. And they had confidence that they could put escrow around to make sure the money wasn't misused. By the time the decision was made and there was actually a signed agreement to move forward with the Burke Hotel, our investigation did show that the Burke Hotel and that project was very different than the other 7 projects. There was no commingling of money. There was no misappropriation of money in the way that there had been for the other projects. So we weren't putting them into the bigger fraud. It was sort of the fraudsters themselves had segregated that project out differently than the others. So we were just making sure that new money wasn't being misappropriated. Now, it turned out that the federal government, USCIS, that sort of controls the immigration piece of this, viewed Burke as part of the larger fraud. We've been working hard as a state to explain to them that Burke should be treated differently. I submitted an affidavit that went, transaction by transaction, explaining that Burke was not a situation where fraud occurred. We didn't include Burke in our case. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, didn't include Burke in their case.
But those investors got, according to Doug Hoffer's report, the state auditor, got shafted more than anybody else.
Yeah, because a lot of the earlier investors got their green card and actually got paid
some money back. Yeah.
So the Burke folks are the ones that, unfortunately are still waiting to get their money back and still waiting to get their green card. Again, the state's has done and will continue to do what we can to convince USCIS of the fact that don't take this out on the investors. They had nothing to do with it. But not only that, but Burke should be treated differently because the fraud actually didn't extend all the way to that project. I understand from the receiver and from some lawyers that represent some of the Burke investors that USCIS has started to approve their immigration status. They've been using this affidavit that the state submitted as part of the evidence in the record. So that's all good news, but it takes a long time for these things to resolve. I mean, this case was brought, 8 years ago, more than 8 years ago. We've been pushing for these investors for years, and the wheels of justice and the wheels of federal bureaucracy turn slowly.
So Doug Hoffer's report, which just came out, where he looked into the state's role in the EB-5, his bottom line was that it was a case of missed opportunities, misplaced trust, lengthy delays, and unfortunate decision-making. What do you think about that as a characterization?
Yes.
Underplay, overplay, just about right?
Yeah, we did a report in 2017, we being the Department of Financial Regulation under the new governor at the time, Governor Scott. He asked us basically to look at what went wrong. And our conclusions, I think they're very similar to Doug's. I guess they're just framed a little bit differently. But we said that, ACCD was, didn't have the necessary expertise, didn't have the necessary resources, and didn't have the necessary authority. So the necessary expertise was sort of that financial expertise, the investigatory expertise, the regulatory background. Those were just not things that their staff had, nor in some ways would you have thought that a staff of a commerce department would have those kind of backgrounds. The resources,
because they were promoters.
They were promoters.
Yeah.
The resource piece was more looking at the fact that at various points during the J-Peak project, there wasn't even a full-time person solely responsible for oversight of the regional center. There were other responsibilities that person had. So they just didn't have enough eyes on the project. And then the authority piece, I think, was a really important one because, as the auditor's report shows, there are times when ACCD would go to the project and say, hey, what's the deal with this? And they'd get an answer or they'd get stiff-armed. And that was kind of, at the end of it, ACCD couldn't go out and subpoena the records from the financial institutions in the way that DFR could. So I saw those as, back in that report in 2017, I saw those as the three critical issues: the lack of the right expertise, the lack of the appropriate amount of resources that were necessary, and then the authority that was necessary as well. And I think those 3 points are lessons that can be extended to sort of any government program as the legislature or as the executive thinks about a program. Making sure there's the right expertise, both in terms of what you expect from the department and also the individuals who actually fill those roles. There's enough resources to do it right, and that you have all the authority, statutory authority that you need to be able to execute on it as well. And then, of course, just as the auditor points out, the conflict of interest that is almost inherent in being a promoter and a regulator. And the state eventually, I think, got that right by splitting it up between ACCD and DFR. We have another regulatory regime, captive insurance, where it's structured in that way.
Right. Yep.
So it's a lesson learned, I think, in terms of, again, setting up the right kind of framework for a regulatory program or really any kind of state program where the state's heavily involved.
The state of Vermont settled for about $16 million with the investors. That number might change depending on how many people get those green cards you mentioned. Was that the right call? Would you have agreed with that decision?
Yeah, it's a tough one because when you go to a jury, you never know what a jury, who they will side with, who they'll find to be credible and sympathetic. Certainly there was harm done here to the investors who were bringing the case, emotional, financial, immigration, professional, personal. If they viewed the state as someone that could help, even if the state didn't have full culpability, if they viewed the state as an entity that could make it better for these individuals, maybe a jury would be sympathetic and try to do that. So it's really a complicated legal analysis. In some ways, it's good that the case is settled and there's finality, both for the investors and for the state of Vermont. On the other hand, $16 million, potentially less than that, is a lot of money for the state to have to pay. So it's a really tough call. I can't second guess the Attorney General on that.
If they'd come to you, what would you have said? Yes, no, what?
The other factor that I don't think we've expressed on this is the investors were trying to bring this as a class action. Now, there wasn't all of the investors. It was a relatively small number of them. But that was denied, and instead of going as a class action, there were many different suits that were filed by many different types of investors in many different situations. So it's not like it would have been one case. It would have been case after case after case after case. And, that means a couple of things. One, that's a tremendous amount of resources for the Attorney General to spend. It's a tremendous amount of resources for all the witnesses to participate in that, for the state to be in the headlines for that long of a period of time. It is not just the risk of one jury, but the risk of many juries. So there is real benefit for that finality. And because the case was going in that direction, because it didn't look like it was going to be a single trial, but many different trials over a long period of time, settling the case was ultimately, I think, a very wise decision. Now, was $16 million the right number? It's hard knowing the case as well as I do. It's hard to say any amount of money is the right number, but in the legal system that we have, sometimes you have to be what's the old phrase there, pound wise, penny foolish, and you want to make sure you don't do that.
You want to be penny wise and pound foolish.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about the three principals: Bill Stenger, Ariel Quiros, Bill Kelly. Ariel Quiros got 5 years in jail, has been unsuccessful trying to get out. Bill Kelly got 18 months, so did Bill Stenger. Bill Stenger got out in 9 months. What do you think about that in terms of fairness and justice?
Yeah, I think a lot about generally, white collar crime, and I think that the trend in the United States has been to look at those kind of crimes more seriously. From the Bernie Madoff situation to now Sam Bankman-Fried, you see some pretty significant sentences get imposed. There were a lot of people that were harmed here, a lot of investors, hundreds and hundreds, or the communities that were harmed as well. And with white-collar crime, it's not like you wake up one day and say, I am really in need of money, and I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to rob that store because I'm in desperate need for something. And this is sort of, or it's a one-time lack of judgment or one-time issue. Every morning you wake up in a white-collar fraud, you have to make the decision that you're going to continue to do the fraud. Every night that you go to bed, you have to make the decision that you're going to allow the fraud to continue for another day and for the hole to get deeper and for more people to be impacted. So in some ways, I think it's a more serious crime than a crime that is sort of spur of the moment or just sort of somebody acts violently and uses a gun to commit a crime, and those folks go to jail for a long time. And I think that folks that commit white-collar crimes, we need to also face serious repercussions. So, again, I'm probably too close to the case to give an unbiased answer, but I would have thought maybe a little bit more time in jail would have been appropriate here.
What about Bill? I know you listened to the interview I had with Bill Stenger. He still today claims that he was somewhat in the dark, didn't really know what Ariel Quiros was doing. Based on your lengthy and serious involvement in looking at all the records on this, does that ring true to you or not?
Well, I think it's pretty black and white. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a charging document that was about 100 pages long and had a tremendous amount of detail in there. And the detail showed that Stenger was familiar with what was going on, helped perpetrate, perpetuate, advance the fraud. And as part of his sentencing, he agreed to all of the facts except for a small handful that were in that 100-page document. And he stipulated to them. He said he wouldn't, present arguments that suggested they were not true. So just from that fact that there were a large number of very specific instances in that charging document that connected him to the case and having full knowledge of what was going on, and that he stipulated to those facts, I think that sort of speaks for itself.
Yeah, but I can hear him saying, well, I did that just to get the plea bargain, and I didn't really know what was going on. So would you call BS on that or not?
It's hard not to, because it's not just, because it wasn't, when a fact in the charging document says you were on this email and you said this, which furthered the crime, those are sort of facts that are hard to dispute. So it wasn't like the charging document was an opinion piece. The charging document was factual, and there were very specific instances and backed up with text messages and emails and witness accounts that served as the basis of it.
We'll continue our discussion with State Treasurer Mike Pieciak right after this. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Back to our discussion with State Treasurer Mike Pieciak. Let's change topics. One of your other big roles in the past few years is really you were one of the key point people on the whole COVID pandemic. I have to admit, my first reaction when I saw you at these press conferences, why is Pieciak, the Commissioner of Department of Financial Regulation, really taking this lead role?
Well, at least you and I were thinking the same thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, that I don't know. I mean, it seemed odd at the time.
Well, I remember.
I mean, I think you proved your worth, but it was just kind of an odd person to be, a numbers person.
So, like most Vermonters, I remember that time really well. And, leading up to the state of emergency the governor declared in 2020, had pretty limited involvement in the pandemic work. I was focused on healthcare because our department regulated the health insurance industry, and at least and we wanted to make sure tests were covered by insurance. We wanted to make sure that treatment was going to be covered by insurance because we didn't want financial burdens to get in the way of, fighting the pandemic. And that was really where I was focused on, was that kind of, healthcare policy. And then the governor had a meeting one day and invited me to it, and it was a COVID response meeting, and most of the folks that were going to the meeting had been heavily involved in the pandemic work. This is the early part of March, and we're all sitting around the governor's cabinet table, and he comes in and sits down, and he was sitting right next to me, and he said, "Well, Mike, you might be wondering why I asked you to be here today," and I kind of was wondering a little bit, and it kind of broke the mood a bit. People were laughing, and then the governor had like a list of things that he was concerned about and focused on, and some of them were things like, what are we going to do about schools, and what's the structure there? Or is emergency management, how are they going to handle this? But then there were some specific things that he wanted me to look at. One was economic. He said, how is this going to impact Vermont's economy? What's it going to mean for businesses? What's it going to mean for state revenues? And it's
okay.
Well, it's funny, right? Because at that time, this was like let's say this was a Friday. I think it was actually a Wednesday, and he declared the emergency on Friday. So it was Wednesday. By Sunday, maybe even by Saturday, we had figured out the economic piece. It was going to be bad. It was going to hurt the Vermont economy significantly. It was going to hurt our revenues. Now that played out very differently because of the way the federal government responded, but that part of the analysis was actually relatively straightforward. The other thing he asked us to focus on was, at the time, the information that was coming out of China and northern Italy was that older people were being hit with the virus more significantly than others. And he was worried that we have an older population in Vermont. So what does that mean for us? Do we need more hospital beds than other states? Do we need more ventilators than other states, more emergency personnel than other states, more tests, more, So we set off on that work too. And we have actuaries in our department that I called in to help with us. We have, folks that do financial modeling that we asked to help with this. We also went outside of our department and tried to find academic experts that were expert modelers that we brought into the team. We worked with an outside firm, Oliver Wyman, who had both health and health policy experts on their team. So we assembled the right people to give us advice. And I remember presenting that to the governor and to the team internally for some time. And eventually the media really wanted to see this modeling that we were coming up with to try to estimate the impact. And at some point the governor said, okay, we'll have a presentation on that. And I remember doing the presentation over Zoom. It was separate from the press conference. It was sort of this one-off press conference. And we walked through the whole thing. We walked through our slides. They were pretty rudimentary at that time, answered all the questions. And I remember at the end of it, I thought, okay, well, here we are. We've shown our modeling. We've shown this information. That's that.
One and done.
And I remember somebody at the end of it saying, when's the next one going to be scheduled for? And I thought, the next one, I thought this was it. And then the other thing that was interesting was I found out that the governor was listening in on the press conference as well. Maybe it was a trial run for all of us. But so then from that point forward, this is like late March, early April of 2020, got incorporated into all those press conferences. And it was, I was the one explaining it. Obviously, I was doing a lot of work as well, but I had a strong team of people both in the department and outside the department helping develop the analysis, helping develop the algorithms that we relied on, the modeling that we relied on. A lot of those things served as the basis for our policy decision making. So we wanted to, bring in as many people with, as bright of minds as we could find to help us come up with the work that we were doing.
Anything you would have done differently now with 2024 hindsight?
It's interesting. I don't think we didn't have a plan going into it, right? And there was no plan in terms of how to do it appropriately, manage the pandemic. But Vermont, I think, did it the best. I mean, during that period of time when there was uncertainty and before the vaccine came out, we were probably stronger in terms of our, policies than any other state. And I think that was the right move. We were worried about life and health. And then during that period of time when the vaccine became available, we were really worried about getting the vaccine to everyone, and we were really good at that in Vermont. And then when everyone had the vaccine, I remember there being that was one of the first times it actually became more political and more challenging to decide on what our policy should be, because there were people who wanted things to get back to normal. That was also the time when Omicron was coming out and people were really worried about the cases, and they wanted us to shut down again. They wanted a mask mandate again. Omicron turned out to be a very different variant than the other variants, more cases, but fewer hospitalizations and fewer deaths. So all of a sudden it presented a much more complex policy picture of what to do. And I remember thinking, boy, like these cases are really high, like we're really worried about this. And the governor was much more not much more. He was concerned about that, but he was focused on reopening the economy, moving Vermont back to where all the other New England states were in terms of their policies. And in retrospect, I think that was the right call. We had to sort of get back to that sort of more normal state. And, a lot of people were critical of us early on in terms of the sharpness of the pandemic policies and all of the requirements that were in place, and they're worried about the economic impacts of that. But our economy's been very strong following the pandemic, and I think we benefited from the policies that we put into place and the way that we handled it, and the perception of Vermont from those that were from outside of Vermont. So I think I'm not saying many of these things are not my calls, so I'm looking at this not judging myself, but really judging the governor and broader administration like Dr. Levine, and think think in an unprecedented situation. Of course, there were probably little things and little policies that, timing and all of that. But when you think about it big picture during those important periods, that pre-vaccine period, the vaccine period, and then that post-vaccine period, I think they handled it as best they could.
What do you think of Governor Phil Scott's leadership capabilities, generally speaking?
Yeah, so, building a team is something that he takes a lot of pride in and takes very seriously. And I remember that in his first cabinet meeting that he had with his cabinet. He talked a lot about that. He described himself as sort of the leader that sets the example and that others want to follow, that he's not going to be yelling and screaming at somebody, nor is he going to be micromanaging. So he wants to set the lead and have others follow. And I think he has, tried to really stay true to that in terms of building the team and then giving the team the power to make decisions and execute on, his vision. So, that's the most valuable thing in leadership, is bringing people along with you and getting smart people to work with you, and then giving them the authority to do it. So I think that, and he's had a team that's been very stable, both in his office and through his administration. There's not been a lot of turnover. There's been turnover, but and that's somewhat remarkable given he's been governor now for close to 8 years, and that we've been through a significant flood and through a pandemic. It's quite surprising in some ways.
You, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is I noticed in the campaign finance reports you've raised, I think, the most money of anybody in a current office, raised over $100,000. I was at a recent event, which was kind of, I don't know, a low-key event. It was a Council on World Affairs meeting where one of the Supreme Court justices was there. And, it's hard for me to not look at that and say, and Moreau Weinberger was there, and think, what's this guy up to? So, and I've also talked to a couple of people that you've explored the idea yourself that you might want to run for governor. You think what is it in your background, your skills, that make you feel like that's something you might consider doing? Yeah, well, I mean,
just to answer the first part of the question, we're focused on being treasurer and anticipate announcing in the near future running for re-election as state treasurer, and not taking anything for granted when it comes to that re-election, and building the financial resources to run and building the political will to get reelected.
And raise enough money now to scare off everybody else?
Well,
yes.
We want to make sure that we are well positioned in the short term, certainly for reelection. In terms of your question about the longer term, it is it's really any position of public service and public trust, whether it's a cabinet member, statewide a leader, serving in a delegation, being governor. It's an incredible honor that I think you have to take really seriously, because people are entrusting a lot into you, and entrusting a lot in terms of the state's finances, in terms of their own personal finances, in terms of their vision and their dreams for the future of our state. So you gotta be really serious about it. And if you think in all of these public service jobs you can bring something to the table and make a difference, then you have to consider it. I don't want to be in politics for a long time. I just turned 40 last summer, and it would be nice, within the next decade to be off doing something, else. But if I can make a difference, I'm happy to explore different ways of doing that.
If Phil Scott, I think we all anticipate he's going to run again. If he didn't, would you change your mind about?
I'd give it a lot of thought. I mean, I want to run for re-election, and that's where my focus is on. If he changes his mind, I think there's a phrase that something along the lines of I always reserve the right to change my mind based on new information, or something along those lines. But that's my focus on re-election, and I anticipate the governor will run again.
But you feel like you would be ready today if he didn't?
I had to give it a lot of thought. I've had about 8 or 9 years in the administration, serving under two different governors. Work at DFR is really important work. I was a commissioner there for 6 years. We obviously worked through the COVID pandemic, now in statewide office. have a good sense of the Vermont economy, have a good sense of the Vermont budget. But like I said earlier, it's nice to, you really have to make sure you're bringing something to the table that's going to benefit Vermont, and that your experience and that your vision is right for the moment. And I know that I have the right experience for this job that I'm in right now, and we've been doing really happy with our team, really happy with the work that we've been doing, and there's more work to be done. So that part of me is very confident in our work as state treasurer.
What you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, though, it's not something you want to do forever. What would you want to do in your 50s?
Yeah, I think my sense is that like your ambitions change over time, right? In terms of is it public service? Is it the private sector? Being in public service does weigh on you. I mean, there's always the immense stress and anxiety of getting things right for Vermonters, and it would be nice to maybe be in a position that had less stress at some point. So, maybe envision that down the road.
Do you find the treasurer's job stressful?
Oh, I think any public service role is stressful. Again, you are making decisions that have real financial consequences for Vermonters, whether it's a policy decision, whether it's an investment decision, how to use your dollars, where to put those dollars. So it can, come with a great deal of stress, and you're working oftentimes outside of normal hours and on weekends and that sort of thing. So, like I said, it's an honor and a privilege to do it. I just think you need to make sure you continue to have the energy and continue to have the ambition for public service. And re-election in Vermont comes every 2 years, so we get the opportunity to check in on ourselves quite frequently. And I know I still have the energy and the ambition to continue this work that I'm doing now.
I've been interested in this baby bonds idea you have, where you would take $3,200, invest it, and have it grow, be an estimated $11,500 by the time a kid's 18, 24,500 by the age of 30. You could use it to either, one, purchase a home in Vermont, start or investing in a business in Vermont, pursuing higher education or job training, or saving for retirement. I guess what really kind of blows me away, you have some numbers also in this proposal where you talk about the top 10% of households hold 69% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% only own about 2.5%. I don't know about you, but watching what's happening in this state in the last 4 years with the number of people living out on the street,
Yes,
the opioid crisis, it just seems like the income inequality, and I've never been a big, philosophical person about this, but you have to be blind to say to yourself, something is really out of whack in this country. It almost feels like we're in one of these kind of gilded eras that we've had going back, I don't know, the late 20s or whatever. What is going on out there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Mark. I mean, I was just up in the Northeast Kingdom last night, and this was the conversation on everyone's mind, was wealth inequality. And the reason it was on their minds is because they've seen it in the last 5 years following the pandemic. They've always had high rates of poverty in the kingdom, but now they're also seeing folks moving into Vermont with extraordinary wealth, building homes that are, these palatial mansions, and really sort of is quite stark when you see that next to a whole neighborhood where folks are just barely getting by and have just barely been getting by for generations. So I think it's come to Vermont in a way that maybe we hadn't experienced, and the data will back that up. We look at who has moved to Vermont following the pandemic, and we've certainly seen a clear uptick. There was IRS data that said 6,000 people had moved to Vermont in 2020 and 2021 combined, 6,000 new filers. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at the previous 10 years, we'd been losing filers every year. So there was a pretty clear change in the trajectory. And then you look at the income levels of those folks, and 77% were earning $100,000 or more adjusted gross income, 50% earning more than $200,000 adjusted gross income. So to me, that signals a lot of them have moved to Vermont with their jobs, that they're working remotely, that they are certainly adding to our state's revenues. We're seeing a clear uptick in our personal income tax revenues over the last 5 years. But it's also put a tremendous amount of pressure on housing that you can make a clear linkage to the number of people that are experiencing homelessness. I think you can make a pretty clear linkage to the folks that are struggling with mental health or substance use disorder because they don't have the ability to get stabilized because they don't have a home. You can make I describe it as the lack of housing is holding back the full potential of the Vermont economy. I frame it that way because you talk to employers and they'll say, we'd like to expand, we'd like to bring on a new product line, but we can hardly keep the business that we have now because we can't find employees because those employees can't find housing.
Right.
You talk to schools and they're having a hard time recruiting teachers. You talk to hospitals, they're having a hard time recruiting nurses. You talk to frontline firefighters or police officers, they're having a hard time recruiting because of housing. You think of our medical costs in Vermont. Folks that are unhoused, they have more need for medical care, and that medical care is delivered in the most expensive way in the emergency departments. And then often it's absorbed into our system because they have no way of paying for it and because they don't have health insurance. You think about traveling nurses that hospitals have to hire because they don't have enough housing for folks to be able to live affordably in the community. And then you think about access to healthcare too. And every hospital will tell you this. We were in St. Albans a few weeks ago as part of this housing initiative we have. And the hospital CEO there talked about doctors that were given offers. They accepted them, came to find a home, couldn't find one, and then ended up taking a job elsewhere. And that's not unique to St. Albans. I've heard that in southern Vermont, here at UVM, central Vermont, all throughout the state. So that lack of housing is clearly, holding us back, and it's exacerbating wealth inequality because if you have a home, you're building equity, you're building wealth. If you don't, it's much more of a challenge and a struggle. But to get back to that inequity point, one of the reasons I think it's so key for us, it's not just because the economy does better when everybody's doing better and you have a stronger middle class. The middle class has more ability to buy things, more ability to consume things. It's better when that wealth is spread out a bit and everybody is doing well. But it's also, I think, foundational to our country and our democracy. I think this wealth inequality is the thing that is fraying our democracy because people don't have hope. They don't see economic futures for themselves. They see a Republican presidential candidate who is sort of speaking to them and telling them that he can fix everything and that the system's rigged against them. And, in some ways the system is rigged against middle class and poor people. And that's why this baby bonds thing really spoke to me, is because it was focusing on making it more affordable for people to live in Vermont by having housing be one of the options for folks to be able to use their baby bond. It talked about breaking that generational cycle of poverty by injecting some capital at an early age for a young person that grew up in poverty. It's thinking about rural economic development because more children in Vermont are born into poverty in the more rural parts of our state. And trying to keep young people in our state too. You have to be born in Vermont and you have to be a Vermont resident at the time you would claim your baby bond. So it's something that really hits on a lot of important policy goals for our state as we look ahead to the next 10 years or so.
What would the cost be, say, over the next 5 years of this?
So every year, based on the way the program was structured, it's about $6 to $6.5 million a year, which is a relatively small amount of money considering the budget is now in the billions of dollars. And I think it's a good investment. I mean, it's investing in people. That $6 million, just in terms of that pot of money, would grow to about $23, $24, $25 million once individuals were eligible to start taking advantage of the baby bond. So it just has an outsized impact. You're making an investment, you're growing that money, and that's having a larger outsized impact when the time comes for it to be deployed back into the Vermont economy.
You think $20,000 is going to make a difference when housing is on average $450 or so? In Chittenden County, I should say, probably $3 something statewide.
Yeah, sort of, it depends sort of where you live, obviously. Depends what you're going to use the money for, and then it certainly depends sort of what other resources that you might have. We had an op-ed supporting this from Ben and Jerry this week, and they described, having $10,000 or so to start their business.
Yeah, okay. That was a few years ago.
I remember. I thought the story was that they ordered the correspondence course for like $3 or something. So
Yeah.
I thought that 10,000 was a lot, but having some amount of money to start a business, having some amount of money to build toward toward a down payment. There was a student more recently that I heard speak to us at the Vermont Student Assistant Corporation at one of their meetings, and he grew up in the Northeast Kingdom and was describing going to school at UVM and how in a few years he'd be graduating with, I think it was $13,000 in debt. And he had gotten a lot of other assistance and a lot of other scholarships. And I did the math really quickly and said, baby bond would have covered the rest of that. So he would be graduating debt free. So it's not the silver bullet, but it combined with other programs, I think can really make a difference. And if you're waiting until the age of 30, it's growing and growing and growing up to potentially, $20,000, $24,000. Isn't enough? I mean, I think if we could afford to do more, there's no reason not to. It's just trying to balance what we can afford in our state in terms of coming out with that initial proposal.
I think you make a fair point that, down payment sometimes is really the obstacle for people too.
Yes.
So, and if, who knows what interest rates are going to be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. Last question, how concerned are you that Donald Trump is going to be reelected?
It's a great question. I mean, I have a lot of anxiety about it. I am more confident following the President's State of the Union address in February, I think it was, and the way that things have progressed since then, that the Joe Biden campaign, is developing the right message and speaking to Americans, and that certainly have confidence the president has the energy and the ability to do the job still, and I think he's displaying that. My concern is just probably from everybody's concern that he's still close in the polls.
He's behind, actually, the latest one I saw.
Trump? Or Biden?
No, Biden is.
Yeah. Just the fact that Trump is either leading or tied even with Biden scares me because, if you stop and think and go back 10 years ago on some of this stuff and say, what would the leading presidential candidates be doing 10 years ago? And if they were doing any of these things, think about 20 years ago when Howard Dean delivered a speech in Iowa where he screamed, and that was disqualifying to be president. Remember the coverage of that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There's 50 things today, I'm sure, that you and I could document that Donald Trump has done that are worse than Howard Dean screaming in Iowa. I think it's because it's little by little, like the frog in the boiling water.
Outrage fatigue, some might call it.
Yeah, that we get used to it. I mean, right now, the former president's in a courthouse. They're picking a jury for one of many different trials. So the fact that all of that is happening, and I view it as such a threat to our democracy and our way of life that it's sort of this post-truth era, and all none of that is good and healthy for us. So the fact that he's even in the mix, that it's close, gives me anxiety. I do hope, at the end of the day, from a strategic standpoint, at the end of the day, the President, Joe Biden, needs to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And if you zone out all the other noise and all the other anxiety and all the other states that could go one way or the other, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, he wins those states, he wins re-election. And that helps me calm myself a little bit. And as I try to think about what can we all do, what can I do to help the president in those 3 states, it's something we think a lot about.
The campaign manager for Bill Sorrell is coming back again. I was thinking back to the Al Gore speech after the 2000 election where he conceded,
yes.
And there was 500 votes in Florida. It just seems like it was a different world, a different time.
Even I was watching, there's a book called Game Change that was talking about the 2008 election, and they made it into a movie. And I was watching that movie recently. It was sort of describing the pick of Sarah Palin and then John McCain's campaign and sort of how that played out. And then on the evening that he lost, John McCain's campaign manager is talking about how critical it is for John McCain to go out and concede the election and why this has been an American tradition for so long, and it legitimizes the returns. And this was written before 2020, this book and the movie. But it's interesting to watch a Republican presidential campaign talk about how critical it is for the losing candidate on the Republican side to go out, congratulate, and bring legitimacy to the process. And, the fact that Donald Trump didn't do that, didn't go to the inauguration, still is not conceded that he lost. It makes people live in a dual reality that, again, is just not healthy for our society or our democracy.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.